Hello everybody, welcome back to the world of Tolkien, and welcome to the penultimate episode of the early history of Middle-earth. The years of the trees are about to end on the worst possible note, and it all started with the release of Melkor. So, let's get to it. If you remember my last video, Melkor had just finished serving out his sentence for nearly destroying the world by being locked up in the halls of Mondos for what can only be described as a literally ungodly amount of time. Now he was being released for what amounts to a divine parole hearing, where he was going to go before all of his former friends and essentially plead for mercy. However, if Manwë thought that 3 ages worth of imprisonment in the dark and gloom with only the dead and Mondos for company had in any way softened his wayward former colleague, then he was sorely mistaken. You see, pure evil, true evil, doesn't simply fade away, especially not when you've locked it up in a dark and gloomy place for a very long time. Rather, it tends to fester, grow even darker, become more malevolent, more hateful. And that is precisely what Melkor was when he was hauled out for the big meeting. Not that he let it show on his face, of course. Even ignoring the fact that he could change his appearance like the other Valar could, Melkor, just like a certain biblical figure that he is a blatantly obvious stand-in for, was a master dissembler. And when he abased himself before the throne of Manwë, his expression was all sorrow and contrition and humility. He begged for clemency. He promised that if only he were given a chance, he would do everything in his power to make up for all the wrongs that he had done. Tolkien doesn't really spend much time on the trial of Melkor. The only detail that were given before the verdict was that Nienna was sympathetic to Melkor's case. But then she is known as the Lady of Mercy, that is kind of her thing. Mondos, for his part, remained silent. This is actually pretty interesting because, given that he was Melkor's jailer, lo these many years, he probably knew his man better than any of the other Valar, and he probably knew that Melkor was most definitely lying through his teeth. On the other hand, Mondos was the prophet of the Valar, meaning he could see into the future, and whenever he spoke, which wasn't often, he often did so to pronounce great and terrible dooms and prophecies. And given that in Tolkien's world, fate is inescapable, just ask poor Turin Turambar if you don't believe me, Mandos probably thought that speaking up one way or the other would be utterly pointless. Now, if you recall my earlier video on the Valar and the Years of the Lamps, you might remember that I said that Manwë, leader of the Valar, was, unlike Melkor, completely incapable of evil. This sounds good, except it came with a rather unfortunate mental blind spot. Manwë was also incapable of comprehending evil. So when Melkor came before him, putting on his best sad puppy dog eyes and said he was very, very sorry, Manwë believed him and set him free. At least free to wander within the confines of Valinor where the other Valar could keep an eye on him. Manwë was hopelessly naive, not stupid. Melkor, of course, eagerly agreed to these terms, and that's pretty much it for the trial. We don't really get any more details about it except that Ulmo and Tulkas did not like Manwë's verdict. Neither of them believed Melkor or trusted him, but their leader had given his verdict, and they chose not to oppose him. As the Silmarillion puts it, quote, "Those who will defend authority against rebellion must not themselves rebel," end quote. So, Melkor was still on a leash, but at least he was out of the doghouse. And he looked about him at Valinor, at the peace and beauty and light and the happiness of the Valar and the elves, and he hated all of it, especially the elves. Melkor was well aware of the fact that it was, at least in part, to protect the elves from him that the other Valar had come together and overthrown and imprisoned him. And just for that, Melkor was going to make the little pointy-eared bastards suffer. But how? Defeat and long imprisonment had taken its toll on Melkor. He was still a being of godly power. No Maiar or elf would have had a chance against him. But he was no longer the greatest of the Ainur that he had been when he'd helped sing the world into being, the entity that had required the combined powers of all of the Valar and the Maiar to overthrow. He was going to have to play it subtle. And so Melkor decided that what he was going to do was turn the elves against the Valar. This, of course, led to the obvious question of how. Melkor knew that he would have no luck with Ingwe and the Vanyar. Of all the elves, they were closest to the Valar, particularly Manwë and Varda, and they distrusted him implicitly. Again, goody two-shoes elves. As for Olwe and the Teleri, Melkor wrote them off as completely useless. Well, with all their nonsense about boats and water. As far as Melkor was concerned, the Teleri wouldn't even make decent pawns. But the Noldor? Inquisitive and headstrong elves always eager to gain new knowledge? This was a material he could work with. And so, Melkor put on his best innocent face and went among the Noldor, offering to teach them certain things. We're never told exactly what. But many Noldor accepted his offer, and apparently profited by this knowledge, whatever it was. And so Melkor soon built up a friendly relationship with the people of Finwë, with one notable exception: Feanor. Feanor is said to have hated Melkor more than any other elf in Valinor, though the Silmarillion does not explain why this was so. This was problematic for Melkor because this was at a time when Feanor was still willing to show off the Silmarils to other people outside of his own family. And from the moment that Melkor beheld those 3 perfect stones, he became determined to destroy Feanor and take the Silmarils for himself. But as the years went by and Feanor grew ever more possessive of his greatest creations, it seemed less and less likely that this could ever be achieved. But Melkor was a patient being, and once he'd established good relations with the Noldor, he began to spread his lies. They were small things, random tidbits, offhand comments, all subtly spoken so that the elves who repeated them were convinced that these thoughts and ideas were their own. Once again, the Silmarillion is frustratingly vague as to what these lies were, but we are aware of 2 of them. Melkor, who at this point knew of the rivalry between Feanor and his half-brothers, began to spread rumors that were calculated to eventually make their way to the ears of the sons of Finwë. Feanor heard rumors that Fingolfin and his sons were plotting to replace him as Finwë's heir, with the blessing of the Valar no less, for they resented Feanor for keeping the Silmarils all to himself. At least, so he heard. Meanwhile, Fingolfin and Finarfin heard tales that Feanor, who had always been Finwë's favorite, was scheming to have them banished from Valinor altogether. But this was all just to turn the House of Finwë against itself. To turn the elves against the Valar, Melkor spread a different kind of lie. A lie that was made all the more effective by the inclusion of a truth that the Valar had neglected to tell the elves. That truth was that there were other children of Ilúvatar out there in the world yet to be awakened. These were the second-born children, the Atani, the race of men. These men were, for lack of any better term, a lesser race. Smaller, weaker, not as good-looking and not as smart, and above all, mortal, with lives that to an elf must have seemed astonishingly short. Melkor's second great deception went like this. The Valar wished to rule the world, but they feared the power and wisdom of the elves, and so they had tricked the elves into coming to Valinor, intending to keep them in a gilded cage. Then they would simply wait for men to awaken and spread across Middle-earth, claiming lands that by right should have belonged to the elves, confident in their ability to better control such lesser beings as these. Of course, this was all a load of bunk. The Valar had never had any intention of ruling the world as tyrants, and they simply hadn't mentioned men to the elves because they hadn't thought it worth mentioning. They had invited the elves to Valinor as a way to protect them from Melkor and his creations, but their invitation was just that, an invitation. The elves had been free to come or not, as they chose. Some elves, if you remember an earlier video of mine, refused to go at all. And if they wanted to, though the Valar would think it ridiculous, after all, who leaves paradise, if the elves wanted to go, they would be free to go. But as I said earlier in this video, Melkor was very good at deceiving people, and this time he was sure to do it right, even though it took him many years to do it. As the Silmarillion puts it, quote, "Long was he at work, and slow at first and barren was his labor. But he that sows lies in the end shall not lack of a harvest, and soon he may rest from toil indeed, while others reap and sow in his stead." End quote. And so the lies spread, and the Noldor began to grumble ever more loudly. And soon even Fëanor, who mistrusted Melkor more than any other, was decrying the Valar as keeping the elves here in thraldom. And because he mistrusted his half-brothers almost as much as he mistrusted Melkor himself, Fëanor set his brilliant talent to the making of swords and armor, the first weapons of war ever made in Valinor. Finwë, disturbed by the unrest among his people, called for a meeting of all the leaders of the Noldor community. Fingolfin tried to speak to his father before the big meeting, trying to convince him to speak against Fëanor and his reckless denunciation of the Valar. Naturally, Fëanor just had to walk in on them at that precise moment, clad in armor and carrying a sword. Immediately jumping to the conclusion that Fingolfin was trying to turn Finwë against him, Fëanor walked right up to his half-brother, pointed a sword in his face, and essentially told him to piss off. When Fingolfin did just that, trying to be the better elf in this situation, Fëanor decided to follow him outside and point the sword in his face again, this time in full view of everyone else. Fëanor, son of Finwë, ladies and gentlemen, overflowing with ego, but lacking in common sense. For the crime of threatening to assault someone with a deadly weapon, Fëanor was hauled in front of the Valar to explain his actions. And the interrogation didn't last all that long before the Valar realized exactly why Fëanor had done what he did and who had put these ideas into his head. When he'd seen Fëanor get arrested, Melkor realized instantly that the jig would soon be up, and by the time the Valar went looking for him, he'd already gone into hiding. This didn't mean that Fëanor was off the hook, however. He may have been an unwitting pawn in Melkor's scheme, but he'd still done wrong. And for his crime, he was banished from Valinor for a period of 12 years, at which point they could possibly discuss the idea of bringing him back, especially if the one he'd wronged was willing to forgive him. Fingolfin, once again playing the part of the better elf and realizing just how Melkor had played him and Fëanor for fools, was willing to extend the hand of forgiveness to his half-brother, but Fëanor remained his typical sullen self, though he did accept the Valar's punishment and went north without any complaint. A few of the Noldor chose to follow Fëanor into his exile, including his 7 sons and his father. And with Finwë gone, Fingolfin was acclaimed the, interim king of the Noldor. Thus, in an ironical way, at least one of Melkor's lies became truth. Speaking of the old devil, Melkor remained in hiding for some time until he was certain that the coast was clear, and then at last, he too went north after Fëanor. By this time, years had passed, and Fëanor and his followers had set up a little holdfast for themselves called Formenos, where they stored all their possessions and riches, including the 3 Silmarils. Melkor must have been really confident in his ability to win Fëanor over despite everything he'd done, because he simply walked up to the gate in his friendliest guise and asked for him. What's really surprising here is that Fëanor actually deigned to receive him. And so Melkor made his little sales pitch. He talked about how all this simply proved that he'd been right all along, that the Valar had punished Fëanor unjustly, and if that he was still willing to leave Valinor and get out from under their thumb, he, Melkor, would be more than happy to help him. But then Melkor made his mistake. he brought up the Silmarils, expressing doubts that the walls of Formenos were strong enough to protect them. At the mention of his greatest creations, Fëanor was overcome with a rage so great that for a brief instant his eyes pierced through Melkor's veil of falsehoods, and he saw him for what he really was, and what he really wanted. Melkor wanted the Silmarils for himself. And then, in the most flowery and Tolkien-esque language possible, Fëanor simply cussed out the Lord of Darkness and slammed the door in his face. Melkor ran away, embarrassed and even angrier than ever. A concerned Finwë, who'd witnessed the confrontation, sent a message to the Valar, and once again they looked for him. But Melkor was too fast and too sneaky, and he'd soon left Aman altogether. Peace had been restored, and the trees shone on. But the Valar were worried. They now knew that the good times were officially behind them. Something big was coming, something bad, even if none of them, except perhaps Mondos, could say exactly what. And so, on yet another ominous note, I must bring this video to an end. But don't worry, next week will be about the final climactic events, the circumstances that finally brought to an end the years of the trees and made Middle-earth the place we know it as today. Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.